This video is EOC Review Unit 4C. So I think this is our third evolution video. And this is over the unit of evolution. And what we're going to be talking about next is particularly this concept of speciation, which we kind of started talking about last time, and some different things that can cause speciation. There are two kinds of speciation, allopatric and sympatric speciation. Allo means different, sim is same. Patric comes from a Latin word patrio, which is like a home nation. And so allopatric is different homeland, and sympatric is same homeland. And so allopatric is when evolution is happening because of different locations. Something has caused organisms to be in different locations and therefore change species, whereas sympatric speciation is happening in the same location. All right. Now, this is caused by something called reproductive barriers. Now, there are two kinds of reproductive barriers. There are pre-zygote barriers, pre-zygotic barriers, and post-zygote barriers, or post-zygotic barriers. Pre-zygotic barriers happen before the production of a zygote. So fertilization doesn't actually occur. The two animals never meet up. Post-zygotic happens after fertilization. So mating has actually occurred and the organism has been produced, and then something else causes a reproductive barrier. So we're going to look at several of these. And another term that kind of puts all these together is this idea of reproductive isolation. Different kinds of reproductive isolations. There is temporal isolation, and temporal isolation has to do with organisms being separated by time. This is a pre-zygotic barrier because the organisms never actually get to reproduce. An example of this: some frogs mate during the day, others mate at night. They never actually see one another. They're crossing paths like ships in the night. They don't see one another. They don't mate with one another. Another example: elk reproduce in early fall. White-tailed deer reproduce in early winter. They reproduce at different times of year, so they have been isolated by that fact. Therefore, they're not reproducing with one another. Habitat isolation. They live in a different place, different homes. The snake that lives in the water and the snake that lives in the tree aren't ever meeting one another, so they're not reproducing. They have been isolated by their different choices of habitat. This is another pre-zygotic barrier. Behavioral isolation. Another pre-zygotic barrier. This is where they have different mating behaviors. One bird dances one way, the other bird dances the other way, and the mates don't recognize the bird that dances the wrong way, so they don't actually ever mate together. That is an example of a pre-zygotic barrier. Another one is geographic isolation. One species lives on one side of the mountain range, another species lives on the other side of the mountain range. They never reproduce. Maybe, there's the I've shown you guys the picture of the two species of salamanders. One lives on the one side of the mountain, another lives on the other side of the mountain. Salamanders don't climb mountains, and therefore they don't reproduce with one another. This is a pre-zygotic barrier. Now, so what are some post-zygotic barriers? Maybe you're wondering. An example of a post-zygotic barrier is something called hybrid sterility. I mentioned this with the lion and the tiger that mate and produce the mythical beast known as the liger. The liger is a hybrid. It is a mix between a lion and a tiger. It cannot reproduce because it is sterile. Sterile meaning it is unable to reproduce. And so these are geographic barrier, or these are reproductive barriers. And because of these barriers, speciation can occur. Now, one thing that we spent some time talking about is something known as a cladogram. And you guys have seen these, and I've drawn them before. And a cladogram just showed shared relationships between organisms. And a given cladogram will have something down here at the bottom, and this is normally known as the outgroup. One word, outgroup. And the outgroup is usually used as a way to measure everything else against it. So if we were going to do a list of all the vertebrates in vertebrate evolution, we might choose for our outgroup a very primitive vertebrate or not a vertebrate at all. And so we might choose, let's say, a beetle. Well, a beetle doesn't really share any of these characters with the other organisms. And these characters are what we call derived characteristics, or characters. And the first characteristic, well, the beetle, what does it share with all the other ones? It's heterotrophic. All right, and so we'll put that trait there. Well, this next trait that since this is vertebrates, we want to go ahead and start talking about vertebrates. So this next trait is just simply the vertebra. And what's the first one to have that? First major group is fish. And so what's another trait that we might come up with? Well, let's say the next one is amphibians. And amphibians have forearms. All right, and then so forth. We can go for reptiles, we could go amniotic egg, and we could go hair for mammals, and so forth. But you can kind of see here. And so how do you use this? Well, let's say we found an organism that had a vertebra, forearms, an amniotic egg, but didn't have hair. Well, we would easily put it in here with the reptiles. Well, let's say that it had all those things, but it also had feathers, like birds, for instance. Well, then we might make a little branch off here and say that feathers go here, and we would write birds there. And so this is just simply used to show evolutionary history and that we can find common ancestry. So the first mammals here have a common ancestor with today's reptiles right there. All right, and so you can use these cladograms to show these sorts of relationships and evolutionary history. Now, real quickly, just to talk about the beginnings of evolution and how the Earth was formed. So you started with the Earth, and way back when, the Earth wasn't what we think of it today with, things like what North America and South America, not like what we think of it today. The Earth was empty, and it was just kind of nothing. Well, this other planet collided with it, and what happened was there was so much energy involved in that, it essentially melted both of these planets. And what happened was all of the densest materials went towards the center. And that's what we think of when we think of our core. And then the next dense material, and then the least, or some of the least dense material, then settled on the top of the Earth. This is like the crust of the Earth, for instance. All right. And then finally, extremely light materials settled in orbit around the Earth. And this is what we call our atmosphere. So this really hot Earth, over time, began to cool. And as it cooled, water vapor from the atmosphere condensed down and formed our oceans. Now, in these oceans, so we have a new world, and it's got some oceans in it, and maybe a big continent here that looks weird. All right, and in these oceans is where life began. And so, because the atmosphere was primitive and there wasn't any oxygen, and also because there was no protection from the oppressive heat of the sun, the red sun, um, organisms had to live in the water. And so they also didn't need oxygen. These first organisms didn't need oxygen. And how did these first organisms come about? Well, two men by the name of Stanley Miller and Urey, don't remember his first name off the top of my head. Miller and Urey came up with this idea that if we can predict what the early Earth atmosphere was like, perhaps we can recreate that condition. And so they set up an experiment. And in this experiment, they had much of the gases that were located in the early Earth. So let me draw this apparatus here. Much of the gases that were located in the early Earth, things like water vapor, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen, hydrogen sulfide, all those different kinds of things. And they exposed them, and so they put them floating around inside of here, and they exposed them to electrodes, which would have represented electricity or lightning, essentially. And as lightning struck these lights, or these gases, along with water vapor, because water's being boiled and being fed into the tube here, water, being boiled, then water vapor mixed with all these gases being shocked in this chamber, and then goes down through this next chamber and meets a condenser, which causes it to go back into solution. This is all kind of circling around here. It's a giant apparatus. And down here at the bottom, there's a little collection tube. And over the course of a couple of weeks, they gathered materials, and what ended up actually being some of this black tar mess gathered in as they ran this experiment. And what they found when they dug up the black tar and looked in the inside of it is they found amino acids. Now, why is that significant? Amino acids are the building blocks of protein, and life doesn't happen without proteins. And so they believe that this would have been the precursor for early life. And so proteins, perhaps in the early Earth, when Earth was this, would have began to form, and those proteins can perform certain functions. Well, perhaps, so here's a protein. Well, a protein that has a covering around it is actually going to be much better than one that doesn't. And so the proteins without the cover aren't going to make it, but the proteins that do are going to make it to the next generation. And the proteins that have a cover, but that are also able to reproduce themselves, are going to be better than those that aren't. Now, how are they going to be able to reproduce themselves? Well, first of all, let me talk about this cover real quick. I kind of skipped past it. Something called microspheres can form around proteins and sometimes in solution, which would have mimicked an early cell membrane. All right. Now, how are they able to then reproduce themselves? Well, this is where the first nucleic acids come in, like RNA. RNA can hold genetic information. It can hold information about proteins. And so if those proteins are then able to be replicated, that little organism is going to live over one that doesn't. Well, RNA isn't particularly stable. And so the organism that is going to make it to the next generation is one that has a more stable version of that genetic code. And this is where DNA comes from, double-stranded, able to better stay, able to better to survive from one generation to the next. And so that protein code is going to survive on DNA better than it would on RNA. Now, these first organisms were anaerobic. Again, they did not breathe oxygen. And so, because there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, and oxygen would have even been poisonous to these early life forms. And so, these first life forms would have been photosynthetic. They would have used the sunlight in order to get energy. And they're also prokaryotic. They're very simple cells. But what's happening as a result of photosynthesis? What's one of the products of photosynthesis? O2. So O2 is escaping into the atmosphere little by little, and as that O2 goes up towards the sun, the red sun, it's going to be reacted, and it's going to create a new product called O3, or ozone. And that ozone is going to be a protective layer around the Earth, protecting these new little cells, and they're eventually going to be able to come up to the surface. And those that come up to the surface, of some of those, variation exists, and some of them are able to actually use oxygen. And so from those first oxygen breathers, maybe some of those oxygen breathers ate other cells, and one of those cells that it ate was a little cell that was able to make its own food. Well, eventually some sort of symbiotic relationship might exist between these two organisms, and that is believed to be the first chloroplasts. And chloroplasts also have their own DNA and have their own ribosomes and that sort of thing, and that's why they're able to uh, that was why they were able to live on their own earlier, but now they've become part of this new cell. Well, this kind of cell, so this would have been the first kinds of plant cells, first eukaryotic cells, plants. Well, you take one of those cells and engulf a little organism that is able to use oxygen, and this would have been the first mitochondria. And so this is when you have the first animal cells, and thus the first eukaryotic cells. And this theory of how the first cells came about and the first life came about, and particularly how these little organisms came to grow and live in the symbiotic environment or in symbiotic relationship with the first prokaryotic cells is called the endo-symbiont theory. So real quick, just a few more terms associated with evolution. We've talked about convergent evolution. Divergent evolution is this idea that you have maybe an ancestral species, something happens, some event causes evolution, maybe a change of the land or something. And from that one organism, maybe several others come about. I don't know. And maybe you have one that has some forearms, something like that. All right, because these different niches may come available. And this idea is called divergent evolution or adaptive radiation. Another idea is coevolution. And coevolution is the idea that two species can change together in order to match one another's adaptation. So an example is there's a moth called the giant sphinx moth, and it has evolved a very long proboscis, this is its mouth, and so that it can pollinate this particular kind of orchid called the ghost orchid. And this ghost orchid has evolved a very long nectar spur, and this is where the nectar is housed. And so these two organisms have evolved together, long mouth, long nectar spur, and so no other moth can feed from it, and they tend to have evolved together over time. Or just another real simple example, a hawk that can see really well is going to catch the most mice. Well, the mice or the mouse that has the best camouflage is going to be able to even out with the best hawk, and then so forth. The hawk that can see that mouse is able going to do better than its friends, and evolution continues that way as well. So that would be another example of co-evolution.